die. It adjourns sine die, which means this is the end of the assembly. This is the end of the meeting. It's not a recurring event. It's a once a year event or once every other year or every 3 years, whatever the documents require conventions to be scheduled. So a convention is a meeting of delegates. An annual conference is a meeting of members. That's the biggest difference between a conference and a convention. Okay, the annual business meeting, it's a yearly assembly for Toastmasters International. It's primarily held for the election of board members and to conduct other business of the organization. When you serve as a convention parliamentarian, it's very important to review the governing documents to ascertain exactly what business can be conducted at the convention. Many conventions allow for bylaw amendments. They might allow for resolutions, like if it's a union type convention, you have resolutions that people adopt. Some conventions, all you do is elect officers and you don't conduct any other business. So it all depends on what that governing document says that you do at that particular convention. So although this is annual business meeting, in fact, it's a convention because you elect delegates. The most important thing for parliamentarians when someone talks to us is, how certain are you that you're going to have a quorum present? You cannot have a meeting unless you have a quorum. And most conventions, there's never a problem obtaining a quorum. At an annual conference, sometimes it's just the number of members that attend establishes a quorum. Usually a quorum is a majority of the people that are registered. And when you say registered, you don't necessarily mean you registered online and paid to attend the commission. It means you actually showed up and signed in at the registration table on arrival at the convention. Most conventions do have a theme. The theme for the 2024 Toastmasters was Once in a Lifetime. It's in Anaheim. And how many of you attended? You want to raise your hand if you were actually attended this convention, either online or in person? Okay, and the most important thing about people attending is you have the delegates who are allowed to vote should sit separately from the members that are attending that don't have the authority to vote. That's the biggest criteria when you set up the sitting for a convention, is the delegates, voting delegates, sit separately from the ordinary members that are there. Prior to the convention, I don't remember what the deadline was, but pursuant to the bylaws, you need to designate who your two members are that are going to be voting delegates. They have to complete their credentials by a certain deadline, and they are the ones that are allowed to cast votes. If you miss this deadline or you didn't designate anybody, you lose out on the voting. Toastmasters documents allow the president or the vice president of education, or you can designate someone else. I think it's from the district. I'm really not sure. I haven't reviewed the bylaws recently to remember that. But you do have some latitude as far as who you select for your voting delegate, but it doesn't, they don't count. Their votes don't count unless they meet the deadline for submitting their credentials online. So it's very important to know who the voting delegates are, what you have to do to make sure you have your credentials and follow that process. Again, join us online. Toastmasters was fantastic in allowing everyone who wanted to join the convention online. We did not have the right to vote. We did not have the right to make motions or debate, but you could watch all the proceedings. And it was very, very interesting, very enjoyable, and well worth taking the time to attend. This is a picture of the convention. I'm not sure what part of it, but you can see there's a lot of people present, and there's only 3 people sitting in the front of the room. This is the president. This is parliamentarian. And to be honest, I don't know who this person is or was. But it's scary because there's only 3 people and everybody is watching the 3 people up at the front of the room. There's no other distractions. And everything you do, every movement you make, every facial expression you make People are watching and they're paying attention. So it's very important that you are adequately prepared for the convention. This is my favorite photo. This is the president who is presiding and the parliamentarian. This is our hero. This is the person that assists the presiding officer in presiding over the proceedings and helps the presiding officer to make any rulings that might come up. Hopefully they have everything planned out ahead of time. Nothing's going to come up that's not expected, but something comes up unexpected. The president is going to consult with the parliamentarian. Where is the parliamentarian sitting? Right next to the presiding officer. That is where the parliamentarian should be sitting. So if anything comes up, you can take care of it. Some organizations don't want to have a non-member parliamentarian sitting at the head table. And what they'll do is they will put a chair behind the president, maybe give you a little table. So you're not on camera. They don't see you. You're kind of hidden behind the person presiding. If they need to consult with you, all they have to do is turn around and you're right there to help answer their questions if they have any concerns that come up. A lot of times you might have a script, someone doesn't follow the script, someone changes the script, something unexpected happens, and it's important for the parliamentarian to be paying attention, to be taking notes, and to be right there next to presiding officer to help them if they need any help during the convention. There's always going to be some kind of snag, something that takes longer than expected, and you have to find a way to keep people occupied. Either have a speaker, have some kind of video, some kind of program. They ended up doing a conga line throughout the room, which was kind of sort of interesting. But, you know, as much as you don't want things to work out, you don't want things to not work out perfectly. You want everything to be perfect, no silent times, no problems. Sometimes it happens and you just have to be prepared. A lot of organizations, they have videos that they can play when you have something that comes up, or you can have people give reports to help fill in time instead of just having a void. When you have a convention, I love it. It's the only time I get to cut. I get to cuss. The acronym is CRAP. CRAP. Those are the 3 reports that have to be adopted at the beginning of a convention. The first report is a credentials report that establishes who the voting members are, how many voting members are present, and what vote is required for majority or 2/3 vote. R is for your rules, your standing rules for the convention. Because this is a one-time meeting with one-time members being the delegates, you have to adopt the rules that you want to follow for this particular meeting. And then the program. The program is the entire, we'll call it agenda. When you have an agenda for a regular business meeting, we have the Mrs. Sun, we approve your minutes, you have reports of officers, boards, and committee people, you have reports of special committees, you have special orders, you have unfinished business and general orders, and you have new business, and you have a program at an ordinary meeting. The program at an ordinary meeting is usually a speaker or an education program for that particular meeting. But when we talk about program for a convention, the program for a convention that you adopt is the agenda, and it includes non-business meetings. So when you adopt the program and at noon, you have a luncheon in such room at such time, you adopt that and that's called a program, but it includes the agenda for the convention. So CRAP is the acronym to remember the sequence of the reports and the motions that have to be adopted. You have to adopt your credentials first to establish who gets to vote. And then you have to adopt the rules so you know what rules you're going to follow. And then you adopt the program because that is your agenda. Does anyone have any questions or comments? I'm Patty Titus. DTM was the registered parliamentarian for this particular convention. And again, she is our hero. She's the parliamentarian. Okay, credentials report. The credentials report at the Toastmasters Convention is very extensive. It's 5 or 6 pages. I only have the first and the last page. It's very tedious. And yes, you use voting machines to help record who's present and who can vote and do the tally and everything. It takes time, and it took a lot of extra time. And when the numbers don't add up, it creates a dead space, which is where you need to have something planned to fill that dead space. Once they got the credentials report completed, it was adopted. And it's very interesting that I can't see the numbers here. There's 19,610 ballots issued, and there's 250 delegates at large. That's a large convention. But this is credentials report that was adopted. This is a report I assume that they used to help figure out, all the different people that got to serve as voting members. A lot of times it's whoever the club submitted, who had districts submitted, and also certain officers, because you're an officer, you're allowed to vote. If you're an officer and a delegate, you only get one vote. You never get two votes. That's a basic parliamentary procedure. Everyone only gets one vote, even though you hold two different offices, you still only have one vote. Okay, the rules for the convention, these are the standing rules, the order of proceedings, credentials committee report, credential requirements, what you had to do, participation authority, timer, the chair appointed timers, proposals, amendment to proposals, time limitation for debate. These are all rules that are usually printed in advance. Some people read them, some people don't. If you're confident that the delegates took the time to read the rules, I would not take the time to read them. But if you belong to an organization where they don't take the time to read the rules, and you're going to have people that are going to participate, they have to follow the rules, it's worth taking the time to read them. I know a lot of my union clients, they have there's three people on the rules committee, and one person reads the first page, another person reads the second page, and the third person reads the third page. So they all take turns reading the rules, but they actually read the rules because they know their members don't take the time to read the rules. And it's important to know the voting procedure. Here it says voting may be by electronic or paper ballot or by unanimous consent. These are very important rules that you adopt that pertain to this meeting only. Implementing a secret ballot requirement, what to do in appeal, motions, and the minutes. So again, those are the standing rules that you adopt for the convention. And then adoption of the agenda is the program, CRAP, program. The program is the agenda. The program includes the agenda, and that's what you would adopt next. Roddy, okay, you have the convention, you go through all the different processes, all the voting procedures and everything, all the reports from people. Toastmasters, I don't think that they did any proposed bylaw amendments. That's probably done by another body another time. Resolutions, again, other organizations have resolutions that be adopted. Every organization has all kinds of different programs. Like Toastmasters has the competition that happens, during the convention. Some organizations have the non-business items first and the business items last. If it's a multi-day professional organization, if you wait to the end of the meeting to have your business meeting, and it does not include election of people because your officers were elected by electronic ballot before the convention, a lot of people leave. So it's always good to have the business meeting early in a 3 or 4 day event to make sure you have a quorum present, and not at the end when you don't have a quorum anymore. Roddy, at the end of the convention, Roddy Spear, our current international president, took office. And the next year's convention is going to be in Philadelphia, August 20th to 23rd. Envision your next move. Join us in Philly. So basically, when it comes to being a parliamentarian, you have to make sure that the credentials committee knows what they're supposed to do. If the credentials committee has any problem concerning a credential, they need to come to the parliamentarian and say what their problem is. It's best for the credential committee to solve their own problems regarding their own credentials. If the credentials committee cannot make a decision regarding the eligibility of any person to vote, it would go to the main assembly to decide. I don't believe that Toastmasters would ever have that problem. Other organizations might. And again, you let the committee try and solve their problem first. The parliamentarian can assist them. If there's absolutely a problem that the committee cannot resolve, then it's up to the assembly to resolve. That's credentials. Adopt the credentials, you know who your voting body is. And again, voting delegates should be seated from non-voting delegates, so you know who votes. If you have voting machines, it's important to have people turn in the voting machine when they leave the room, so they don't just give it to the person sitting next to them to vote when they're not present. It's very important to keep track of that. Rules, once you come up with standard rules, pretty much they don't change from year to year. You just need to review them. During COVID, there was a huge, when people decided to have virtual conventions instead of in-person conventions, it involved special rules of order, and we had to come up with rules that would meet all the needs of the individuals. If you have a hybrid convention where you have people voting in person or people voting electronically online, you might want to consider a third-party election buddy or someone to handle the voting where everyone votes the same way using the election buddy, so you don't have a disparity between people voting in person and online. You have to make sure that someone in person isn't voting twice by voting online. So the rules are pretty much the same. If you had special rules during COVID and you're meeting in person again, it's better to look at the rules from like 3 or 4 years ago before COVID to see what standing rules the organization is accustomed to, and not just the most recent rules. And the program, again, it includes non-business items. So do not confuse the program adopted at a convention with the term program that is used during in the agenda of an ordinary society in addition to the standard order of business. Does anyone have any questions about anything that we've covered? Penelope.
I'm sort of going to double back on that program idea. And again, I only know from Toastmasters, the annual business meeting is treated as basically a completely separate event. And its agenda is not included in the convention program, and none of the convention events are included in the business meeting program. And
Yeah.
And is that unique to this organization? Is that
I'm not going to say it's unique. Many organizations, if you have a 3-day convention, it's going to have what's called a program, and it's going to say on the first day, your business meeting is 10 to noon and 2 to 4. And on the second day, your business meeting is, we'll say 10 to noon and 2 to 4. On the last day, your business meeting is 10 to noon. Even though it's called a program, it includes that information, and that's what's adopted by the convention. And I understand what you're saying. The program, the agenda that's adopted at the convention does not list non-business meeting items.
Yeah, there's nothing adopted in any at any point in any day except when the business meeting is called to order.
Yes.
And there's no forum and no other requirements for any other part of the it's called a conference.
Correct. Yes. And that's another thing too. If you have a conference and it's not technically a convention where you have delegates, you still need to have a report of how many people are in attendance. So even though it's not a convention and you don't adopt a credentials report, you still give a credentials report so you know how many voting members are present for them to vote.
We do that at the business meeting only, but
Right.
there's no other requirements for anybody to walk in the door for the, yeah,
Right.
sorry. Okay, I see you have several other questions coming your
Yeah.
way here.
There's a difference between a business meeting and a non-business meeting. And you do not have to have a quorum present for a non-business meeting. That is correct. Myra, did you have a question?
Yes, just for clarity, are the standing rules adopted in the annual meeting?
Yes, if you have, okay, again, part of the problem with English and parliamentary procedure, I call it a Swiss Army knife. You have different terms with different meanings, and when you want a certain term, you have to realize what situation you're talking about. Sometimes when you have an annual meeting, if your organization has regular monthly meetings, and one meeting you elect officers and you have reports from the previous officers and committees. That's a regular meeting that's designated as an annual meeting, and it's called an annual meeting. Then you have what's commonly referred to as an annual conference. An annual conference is a meeting that you have once a year. With our parliamentarians, we have a unit meetings, it could be monthly. And then once a year, our state association has a meeting. It's not a convention because we don't have delegates from the units. It's called a conference where any member of the state association can attend that annual meeting. It's an annual conference. We do not adopt a credentials report, but a credentials report is given to say how many voting members are present and how many non-voting members are present, and if there's any other dignitaries present. When you have a convention and it's like an annual meeting where you have delegates, is where you would adopt a credentials report and the rules for that meeting and the program for that meeting or agenda. Did that answer your question?
So you don't adopt the standing rules for an annual meeting is what you're saying?
You would, if an annual meeting, okay, if the annual meeting is a regular monthly meeting that's called an annual meeting, you do not adopt rules. Whenever you
Okay.
have a meeting that's once a year, even if it's more than, less often than quarterly, you probably want to adopt rules for that meeting to designate how things are supposed to occur during that meeting. So if it's an annual conference, yes, you would adopt rules for that meeting, but they only pertain to that meeting only. Just like you would adopt the agenda for that meeting because it's less often than quarterly.
Okay. Thank you. And one final question. What was the P in CRAP?
Program,
Okay.
credentials, rules, and program, CRP.
Okay. Thank you.
Makes it very easy to remember because some organizations, they'll adopt the rules before they adopt the credentials report. And it's like, well, you haven't decided who gets to vote yet. So how can you adopt the rules for the convention if you don't know who can vote? So it makes it very easy to remember. Jenny, did you have a question?
Yes, I may have misoverheard, but wouldn't you suggest that everyone read the governing docs so that A, they understand their rights, and then especially for officers, they can help answer questions or motivate their members for engagement? Because somewhere I thought I heard that you mentioned, oh, join the convention, but even though you have no right to vote or no right to something. And that also reinforces like to know that any delegate, the delegate could be, as Penelope wrote in the chat, it could be either a member of the club, an officer of the club, a district leader, or any member of Toastmasters in or outside of your district. So by having everyone read those governing docs, policies, and programs, they're empowering themselves with their rights or complementing each other's blind spots and discussing to reinforce what they know or to learn more from each other versus saying, oh, well, I don't need to read the rights because our officers are going to read it. And what if the officers have a misinterpretation of the rights?
As a parliamentarian, I would always recommend that every member read their governing documents. That is definitely a strong recommendation. However, in real life, we know people don't take the time to read their governing documents. They don't read them until they have to. They don't read them until they want to. They don't read them until they have a problem. When someone asks a question, and Toastmasters might be different because it has 3 different layers. But many organizations, someone says, well, when are officers elected or who are the elected officers? It's very easy to say, well, read the bylaws. Or you could go ahead and answer the questions so they don't have to read them because they're relying upon you to interpret them. And like you said, you might remember part of them, but you don't remember everything. And the more knowledgeable the members are, the better your organization is going to be able to operate. I know recently, this is the season to pay dues, right? And, I paid dues for this, 4 or 5 different groups. And this one group, it's like, well, wonder how to pay their dues or what their dues are. And I could have asked, but thank goodness I took the time to look at the governing documents to discover they didn't have dues. So as a parliamentarian, I would have been embarrassed if I asked about dues and it says, oh, we don't have dues. They would have thought, why didn't you read the governing documents? Well, thank goodness I did. But we know people are people, and certain groups, people aren't going to take the time to even read the standing rules for their convention. And that's where, if you have members that are going to want to participate in debate and you have members that are going to want to make motions, it's very important to take the time to read through the rules and procedures so the members hear what they need to be reminded. So when the time comes for debate, they understand what might they have to go to and they understand what the process is. So you don't waste a lot of time explaining things when it's easier just to read the rules at the beginning. Tom, did you have a question?
Sure. So could you clarify again what the basic difference is? The basic difference between a convention and a conference is just the delegates?
Yes, a convention is a meeting of delegates. A conference is a meeting of members. So if you have an organization and any member of that organization has the right to attend and vote, that is a conference. If you have a convention, that means delegates are elected and only the delegates that are elected and registered are allowed to vote. You might have members in attendance, but they don't have the right to vote.
Okay.
Beatrice?
So I
Thank you.
guess tag teaming onto the question Tom just asked, what is the clear difference between an annual business meeting and the annual conference, right? Since neither, it sounds like, so we know the conference doesn't have delegates. They have credentialed members, but they don't have delegates. The convention does, right? But for the annual business meeting, is there a distinction between the 3, or is it that it fits, it's kind of like a, oh my goodness, the circles, the overlapping circles that it can fit in
Right.
either or. I forget the name of them. There's an actual name for it. Sorry.
I know exactly what you're talking about. A annual conference. Typically, when you call something an annual conference, they only meet 1 time a year, and that's on an annual basis, and it's usually to elect officers, maybe do bylaw amendments, and maybe adopt resolutions. But the main purpose is to elect officers for the upcoming year, or if it's biannual conference for the upcoming 2 years. So it's an organization that only meets 1 time a year. That's an annual conference. You can have an annual business meeting that is a regular monthly meeting. So if your organization, like our club, Virtual Parliamentarians, we meet every month, the first Wednesday of every month. And every month when we meet, it's a regular business meeting, except in, I'm going to say, is it May, when we elect our officers? When we hold our elections for our officers, that makes it an annual meeting where you have the outgoing officers and committees report on the past year, and you have the incoming officers are elected. That's called an annual meeting. And it's a regular business meeting. A lot of times when you have a regular business meeting, the agenda includes the Mrs. Sun, which is your regular order of business. And under special orders is when you have your elections. So it looks and feels like a regular meeting, except you have election of officers. When you have an annual conference, typically you call the meeting to order, you have your credentials report, so you know how many people are there. Yes, you do adopt rules because it's usually instead of 20, 30, 40 people, you might have 150 people. You have special rules that want people to follow. So you do your rules and you adopt your agenda, or if you want to call it your program. Because it's for that one meeting only. So that's the biggest difference between an annual conference and a regular business meeting that is called an annual meeting because you have elections. As a parliamentarian, once you start serving a client and you're preparing for a conference, convention, whatever it happens to be, you need to ask for governing documents. You need to read the governing documents, look at the governing documents. I always ask if I could have a copy of the agenda and the minutes from the last conference or convention. Sometimes they send them to me, sometimes they do not. I have to make sure that the convention is properly noticed. Usually you just say the convention is such organization is going to be held at this hotel in this city on these dates. It has to be sent to the members on time. Many large organizations have staff and staff has a lot of experience. So it makes it very easy to serve as a parliamentarian. And then the question becomes, well, what happened at the last convention where you had problems, and how can we make sure that we don't have those same problems at this convention? And then if there's anything unanticipated that might come up, if you have proposed bylaw amendments, which ones are controversial, which ones are not controversial. There's different ways of handling bylaw amendments at a convention. If you only have one or two isolated amendments, you might vote on them one at a time. If you have a lot of bylaw amendments, you could choose to do them seriatim, where you consider them one at a time and you amend them one at a time. And then you take one vote at the end to adopt them all at one time. Or you can use like a consent calendar where there's a motion made by the bylaws committee chairman. On behalf of the bylaws committee, I move the adoption of the proposed bylaw amendments as noticed. So you have the motion to adopt them. And the chair will say without objection, we will consider them using, consent calendar, which means you vote on them all at once. After each member has an opportunity to pull the ones that are contested from the consent agenda. So if you're going to want to debate or you want to vote no, you have to be sure to pull that one proposed amendment from the list and ask that be considered separately. You don't have to say why, you just say, I request that number 23 be pulled, and then it's pulled. You take one vote to adopt the remaining proposed bylaw amendments on the list, and they're all adopted. You have to look at the bylaws to figure out if they go into effect immediately on adoption or if they go into effect at the end of the convention. And then the ones that were pulled are considered separately. They might be amended, they might have a lot of debate, be adopted, or the people might want to vote no for the ones that were pulled. So back in the 20 years ago, we voted on the hard ones first and then had a motion to consider the rest in gross, and we did those second. Well, now the trend is to consider the easy ones first to make sure they get done, and then the ones that are pulled you would consider separately. Jenny, did you have a question?
It's to build upon the previous one where if it's encouraged that everyone read their governing docs, yet none of the organizations that I belong to actually go over to review or train their members on the governing docs, then of course, how do you expect people to know the value of reading the governing docs to want to read it? So it's sort of like a chicken or the egg. And if the officers don't encourage everyone read the governing docs and just assume, oh, just rely on the leaders to interpret for you. And sometimes the leaders are human who make mistakes too, or misinterpret, or may have blind spots themselves. I think, it's not fair to say, oh, people are people, they're not going to read. Part of it is that they don't know what to read. They don't know the importance or the value. And that's where leaders have the ability to educate them on the influence of that. So what is the club, or what can clubs and parliamentarian units do to motivate their members to read the governing docs so that they are empowered to know their rights and empowered to step up when it's time to nominate and elect officers, and they know how to advocate for themselves or others?
As a parliamentarian, when someone asks me a question, if it's a client that's paying me to be their consultant, it's my job to read the documents and explain the documents to them if they have questions. If it's another parliamentarian or someone I know well enough, I can say, well, what do your bylaws say? They ask me a question, I'm like, well, what do your bylaws say? And even when people ask questions about the governing documents, I will say, your bylaws say this or your bylaws say that. And it's not like I'm making up these things. This is what your governing documents say. The governing documents are adopted by the members, and the members decide how much authority they want to give to individuals and other groups. And they have the right to amend them to take that back. I know when I first started, I belonged to a professional association, and I was young at the time. And I referred to all the old ladies, and I would ask them questions, say, well, how is this person get to be a recording secretary? And they always kept telling me, well, look at the bylaws. They would never tell me the answers. They forced me to look at the bylaws. And I learned to stop asking questions and look at the governing documents. Sometimes people don't understand what the governing documents say because they're so convoluted the way they're written. And then you might need someone to interpret them. And that's why people hire parliamentarians, is to help them. Hattie, go ahead.
My question had to do with the consent calendar. If you're going to pull out some amendments that you want to have considered, with the remaining ones, if you're required by your bylaws to vote by ballot, how does that work?
I would vote by ballot. If the bylaws require by ballot, usually they require by ballot for election of officers, not necessarily for bylaw amendments. But if you had, and I've seen organizations with like 120 bylaw amendments. And
Okay.
it's like, well, which ones are controversial? Well, these 6 are controversial. Okay, so you pull those 6, and then the question is on the adoption of the remaining proposed bylaw amendments. And if you're required to do a ballot vote, you take a ballot vote to vote one time to adopt all the remaining amendments. A lot of
Okay.
times instead of ballots, they use machine voting now. The only thing is, as change is hard. It was easy to say, we'll do the difficult ones first, and then all the remaining proposed bylaw amendments will take one vote and adopt them in gross. Now they want you to adopt all the easy ones first and do the harder ones second. And it's just a different philosophy, because you have to be very careful that none of the ones you adopt conflict with or have a problem with the ones that you haven't voted on yet. So you have
Okay.
to be extra careful in the order that you vote on them.
Okay, well,
Okay.
when I said ballot, and you say machine, one of the organizations that I'm in, we use our electronic devices. So
Yeah.
it's set up that way that they send us a link, and when we get the link, then you go ahead and you can vote using your electronic device. So, okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, and that's an important thing to mention, because some people want to use unanimous consent to adopt the remaining bylaw amendments. And being conservative like I am, you can't just do it without objection. These amendments are adopted. I'm conservative, and even though you're voting on, say, 100 amendments at one time, and you're only taking one vote, to me, it's very important to actually take a vote to where 2/3 of the people vote yes.
Right.
We want to adopt these 100 amendments all at once.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, don't confuse unanimous consent with a consent calendar. And I've even had people try and tell me the proposed bylaw amendments that are not controversial can be adopted with consent calendar, like at the beginning of a meeting. And I'm like, no, I don't think so. When you have a consent calendar at the beginning of a meeting, those are routine matters. And a bylaw amendment is never a routine matter. So you have to have the motion first to adopt them as noticed, then you can do a consent, and then you do the individual ones separately that have been pulled. Okay, Jenny?
It's going back to the question of the governing docs, where sometimes they're written without context from the member's perspective, especially if the leaders that wrote them don't have any understanding of the value of parliamentary procedure. And especially if parliamentarians don't belong to the organization that they are consulting with, they may not have the context from the governing docs to properly advise the client on the intentions behind why the policies and protocols were written that way, which then goes back to encouraging the client themselves and the members to again read the governing docs, because they themselves as members probably have more context than the parliamentarian if they're not a member themselves. And at the same time, it's important for them to collaborate and consult each other to reinforce what they agree on, or to have a discussion if they disagree on different interpretations of the same governing docs, which is incredibly possible. So I don't think it's fair to assume that, oh, you pay a parliamentarian and they can interpret your docs and they know everything to be true, because in part, it depends on the context of what they know, where they belong. And sometimes the original source is not completely prescriptive with all the context and intent that's needed to understand why the policy and protocol was written that way. So again, the question goes back to, how do we encourage more people to read and empower themselves with reading the governing docs and policies and protocols, and not to rely on others to do that for them, given those potential mistakes or misinterpretations or without the context that's needed.
Right. If you read Robert's Rules has a whole section on interpreting bylaws. And it helps people to understand how bylaws should be interpreted. And again, that's advanced training for parliamentarians, not the everyday person would necessarily understand everything that might be written. Any other questions or comments? All right, so conventions, it's important to have proper notice. It's important to have a quorum. It's important to adopt the convention reports at the beginning, credentials, your rules, and your program. It's important if you have elections and they might be contested to schedule them early in the convention to make sure that you accomplish what business has to be accomplished at that convention. When the convention is adjourned, it's called sine die, which means any business that's not handled at convention falls to the ground unless you have a rule in your governing document that gives authority to executive committee or someone else to consider anything that was not taken up at the convention. Any other questions?
Did you mean to not share your screen at this point?
Yeah, I don't have,
Okay, you're done
Unless
with
you want
sharing the
to-
screen.
unless you want to watch our hero, Patty, sitting next to the presiding officer presiding. If you're ever asked to be a convention parliamentarian and they don't let you sit next to presiding officer, you might have a problem. Text messages, you could do as long as you have sufficient bandwidth. But it's very important to be sitting next to or behind the presiding officer. If you're sitting next to the presiding officer and everything is recorded on camera, you have to be very cognizant of your facial expressions, because people will react to what you do with your face. Corliss, go ahead.
Opera. Based on your experience with the Toastmasters convention, What similarities or differences did you see between the Toastmasters and the NAP conventions? Okay.
Oh, that is a very tough question. I say the
Well,
biggest,
I meant because when you talk about standing rules, we'll take a whole day on standing rules.
right.
NAP.
I want to
I was
say
just
that
wondering what you felt the differences or similarities were.
whenever I attend as a parliamentarian or watch a convention, I'm always interested to see if they do the three, CRP correctly at the beginning of the convention. And it's always interesting to know that the voting members sit separately from the non-voting members. Both conventions, they have proper seating. They both make sure you have a quorum present. They both adopt the reports in the proper sequence. Parliamentarians, we tend to want to show off our skills and our abilities. And we will make things that should be easy, difficult. If I ever had a client that had a convention or a meeting like a national NAP convention, I would be very embarrassed and I would feel like I failed. But you have to understand that when you get a bunch of experts together, we all want to show how we're experts and we want to pick apart everything. And most ordinary groups, and I dare I say trust? I mean, they trust the credentials report. They don't question it. The standing rules, they just trust it and they adopt it and they don't really want to deal with them. They just want to vote on whoever's elected and get out of there because they have a Broadway play to go to or something. But when it comes to parliamentarians, we all have to show our muscles. Do you have any comments that you'd like to share with us?
To Jenny's point when she spoke on educating businesses or whoever you are assisting with their bylaws. Generally, by the time they call a parliamentarian, it's when they need assistance with those bylaws and they have read them. So what they're trying to do now is put them in compliance with whatever's going on in their organization at that time. It's not that they haven't read them. Usually those bylaws are so old, they don't know how to begin to amend them. And that's when they call perhaps a professional parliamentarian to come in and help them amend those bylaws to where they are now, choosing the right wording. Where does this go? What part of the bylaws does this go? This go in membership. And then, they have more than the 9 articles that they have, So that's generally when they call in a parliamentarian because they need assistance in amending the bylaws. It's not that they haven't read them. They have read them, but they're so old, they just don't know how to begin to amend them. And that's where the assistance from us. And it comes with a conversation with that organization. Well, what do you want to do? What do you want to say here? So it's not that they go in and just all of a sudden just blanketly amend their bylaws, but it happens with the conversations with the organization. Thanks.
My phone. Right. Any other question? Okay, Hattie, go ahead.
I belong to an organization that grew from 28 members to 144 members. And I can tell you, I bet you 40 of those members have not read the bylaws. And our bylaws are not old. We review our bylaws every year. Whether we change them or not, they are reviewed every year. And although we encourage the members to have their copies and to bring their copies to the meetings with them so that they will know what's going on or what the rules are when we get ready to address something, as well as bringing their standing rules or policies with them. I have had members say it's too much to read and they just don't want to. They don't want to. And they're grown. All of these women are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, or whatever, and older. You cannot force grown people to go ahead and study what they
Right.
don't want to study. So If they get caught up in it, they get caught up in it. And they don't worry about it, like you say, until an issue comes up. And then they want to know, well, where is it? Where is it found? Or where does it say that? Well, if they had been going along or reading them all along, they would have known. But it happens.
Thank you, Hattie. A very good method when you have newly elected officers is to dedicate an hour, 2 hours to training and parliamentary procedure. There's times where like a civic association contacted me because they had problems. And to me, the easiest way to resolve their problems was to force them to read their documents. And I knew they weren't going to read them individually. So we scheduled a Zoom meeting and we had training in parliamentary procedure. And I talked about the hierarchy of governing documents. I talked about meetings and a quorum and agenda and minutes and stuff. And then I actually took the time to go through every article in their bylaws and explain the articles to them to force them to see what their own documents say so they could figure out themselves what their own problem was and resolve their problems without having to say, well, you're right and you're wrong. And it worked out very well. I mean, whatever problems they had, the answers were in their governing documents. They just had to take the time to read them. By having a Zoom meeting and parliamentary training, it forced them to do that. So any other questions about conventions? Okay, Toastmasters upcoming convention is in August in Philadelphia. I think it'd be well worthwhile to attending if anyone's, available. Last year it was on the West Coast. This time it's on the East Coast. And it would be a great experience. I know a lot of people had a lot of fun, right, Penelope? They did have, voting people sat different from non-voting people, right? It was separated.
A little bit.
And you voted by
Sort of
machines?
theoretically.
Yeah. Did you have machines when you voted? Is that how you voted?
Yeah. But in Toastmasters, to your point of the Toastmaster delegates are clubs, not individuals. I mean,
Right.
it's the club has 2 votes and the club can
Right.
assign its votes. And the vast majority of clubs simply assign their votes to their district's incoming district director. They don't bother to pay more attention than that.
Right.
So you have district directors that have, many votes, who may carry the votes for, up 90 or 100 clubs.
Right. And the fact that it's not one person, one vote makes it more difficult to tally the results of the vote, which means you need people that have experience doing that to make sure it comes off smoothly. I know during this year's convention or conference, there was a huge lag. A lot of times when you give out machines, you do a test vote first to make sure everyone machines vote work and that the votes total up to what you show on the credentials report.
But
And they had
this
a
year
problem.
we didn't have, in the past, we've had literally physical extra machines. In this case, you had to use your own iPad or phone. And that was part of the
Okay.
problem. So the problem really was connectivity, that people couldn't their
Bandwidth.
phones would drop or they couldn't figure out how to log on. Although we had also many hours of delays when we had the little machines that you voted on. There doesn't seem to be a perfect answer.
No, but bandwidth is definitely a serious consideration. Two common issues with credential reports is the people in the back don't always have sufficient bandwidth to have their votes recorded. And the people on stage, if you have like 10, 15, like all your elected officers or board members up on stage, they still have to register for the convention. They have a vote. We know they have a vote. We know they're there because we can see them, but they still have to register. And if they don't take the time to register, your credentials report is not going to add up to the correct number when you vote. So those are the two most common issues when the machine voting does not add up to the total on the credentials report. Any more questions? Go ahead.
I'm not trying to put you on the spot on this one. I know you've talked a lot about conventions, but in terms of delegates, I mean, as I said, Toastmasters has a very specific way of determining who the delegates are. The delegates have to register, as you said, by a certain date. We have to, when we get there, we have to physically acknowledge that
Sure.
we're there. But can you give any insight into other ways of, or other things that affect delegates, or how other organizations choose delegates? Maybe it's all the same, and it just depends what the words
It's-
are.
Yeah, every organization is different. Some organizations actually take the time to do a roll call. So if you have 50 states, they will call each state one at a time, and you report how many delegates are present. And it can take an hour, hour and a half. That's their custom, and that's what they want to do. Who am I to come in and say, don't do that that way? That's what they want. And you have to respect other organizations' customs and process. So problems with a credentials report, I've seen like at unions, you're supposed to have a local union meeting, and during that meeting, elect your delegate and then submit that person's name for the state convention. And some local unions might not have a meeting where they elect a delegate, and the head of that local chooses someone to be the delegate for the state convention, and that the state convention is someone from that local or a friend is there. They're like, we know this local did not have a meeting, so we are contesting this delegate because they were not elected by their locals. They were appointed by the head of that local, and that's not a valid delegate. And
That seems
that's
pretty
where,
straightforward
they
then.
have to.
Yeah.
Yeah, most delegates, it's pretty straightforward who they are, how they're elected, and you have to be sure and follow the process. The thing that's different with Toastmasters is the delegates have to be registered ahead of time. And other organizations too. I know NAP, we have to register, send our delegates like in July for the convention that might be in August or September. And you alternate delegates. A lot of organizations, you have a delegate, and if they can't stay or can't come, you have an alternate that automatically takes the place of that delegate. And it's supposed to be, the alternate does not take the place of the delegate unless the delegate actually leaves the convention. You can't say, well, I'll sit at this one and you sit at that one. It's more permanent, more definitive as to when the alternate actually takes place. And when you have a delegate leave the convention, you have to actually go to a registration table and transfer the credentials from one person to the others. Many conventions, you have sergeant at arms committee, and they're at the doors of the convention, and you have to show your credentials to get into the convention. Sometimes they have, the voting delegates in one room and the people that are there to watch in a different room. So everyone has to do what they have to do based upon the size of their convention. You watch the Democratic convention and the Republicans convention, where you have tens of thousands of people. It's going to be a different process than if you have a convention with just like 200 or 300 people. Any more comments or questions? Then, okay, after the convention, it's very important for the parliamentarian to pick up all of their papers. You don't want to leave any scraps of papers with notes about anything that happens. You pick up all your papers and notes and everything, take it with you. Some parliamentarians go ahead and review the minutes for the convention with their clients part of their contract, others don't. Many conventions will keep using the same parliamentarian because they're familiar with the process and the organization. If they have a problem, then they might change parliamentarians, but most of the time they keep the same person from convention to convention. Some organizations will change parliamentarians to where if you're on the East Coast, they get someone from the East Coast. If you're on the West Coast, they get someone from the West Coast to make it more affordable when it comes to travel. But today's travel, when, if a room's $150 a night, it's not that big of a problem for the convention to pay for it. I have gotten to where I show up a day ahead of time because I've incurred so many delays in travel. When you're the parliamentarian, you have to be there. As soon as I arrive on site, I contact the individual I'm working with. I'm here. If you have any questions, need anything, let me know. Other parliamentarians, it's like they need their time at night. It's their private time. And they're like, I'm here. If you need me, I'm available at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. So whatever your policy is, you have to make sure that's in your contract. So, okay, well, listen, that's it. Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster.
Let me stop the sharing at this point. Stop the recording.